Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, I assure you. But here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming, especially during these past 2 years. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, and Talking Toddlers, this podcast helps you develop that with clarity, confidence, and clear communication. So let's get started. Welcome back to Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin Heyer, your host. And this week, we're talking about the relationship between speech development. And last week, we talked about what is speech as it's connected to language processing. So speech are the physical parts of making the sounds and connecting them to have conversations, right? And how is speech and eating development, those skills, interconnected, and how are they related? And is that important as a new mom or a new dad when you're looking at this brand new baby? And I know there's a lot of buzz, especially on social media these days, about breastfeeding and versus bottle feeding, baby-led weaning, and all of these things. And what does a brand new mom do, right? And we have kind of some plans, and sometimes it doesn't go the way that we want. But today's purpose of this episode is really looking at the connection between speech and eating and how those two are in sync, and that the umbrella is oral motor development and how it really is designed. I mean, babies come into this world with this brilliant design. Our creator is just breathtaking when we start peeling back and analyzing how we human beings have grown and developed. So with that in mind, a full-term, uncomplicated delivery, the baby comes into this world with this. So think about your baby's mouth is very, very different than yours or mine as an adult. Adults would have a seriously hard time sucking from a bottle nipple. I know that could throw some of you, but what a baby does with sucking, nutrients from even a bottle versus a mother's breast, that whole system, you and I couldn't do. We couldn't, if our life depended on it for survival, we couldn't do it very well. Trust me. But because of the way that the structure and function of a newborn baby's mouth, who is healthy and full term and uncomplicated birth, right? The healthy average baby out there, because they come into this world totally helpless at birth, which I've mentioned before in other episodes, in order to survive, the baby and the brain and the head had to be still under construction. So the baby is wired to connect to a human voice, because that human voice is going to feed me either via a bottle or a woman's breast milk. And the number one goal is just to be fed and protected, kept warm and all of that. But how the structure, that's the physical part of how this baby, the thick, fat sucking pads, and how the bones in the palate, which is the roof of the mouth, they're they're slightly touching at birth. They're not fused. There's skin tissue that holds them in place, but it's all designed to do one thing, which is to suck nutrients from a bottle or a breast. And so let's take a look at each one of these kind of developmental periods, like from 0 to 3 months and your 3rd month through your 6th month. But I really want today to kind of dive deep into this speech and eating relationship for that first year and how they're really in sync. And parents, I think, could be so much more empowered when they understand what's happening and why. And I think, again, in this modern, busy world that we live in, we rush through each and every one of these stages. So our creator also was brilliant in giving babies these primitive reflexes that will, again, give them the ability to survive, which is to actually find a nipple and get nutrients. And so some of these reflexes, just to highlight some of the ones that are really, really relevant to eating and speech, are the rooting reflex, the suckling, the swallow reflex, the bite reflex, transverse tongue reflex, and then we'll also look at how those kind of relate to some of the muscle motor planning. So a rooting, and I'll just whip through some of these, but I want to kind of lay the background so you understand how all these pieces fit together. So rooting is located at the cheek. When there's a light touch, they will be able, they don't have to think about. These primitive reflexes are subconscious. They're automatic. And so it's a reflex to locate the breast. And that's their number one goal, right? Besides being warm and hopefully dry, but is nourishment. And so the rooting reflex, they begin to control it after the first month. But so for those first 3 or 4 weeks, it's just a reflex and they will respond. And then it seems to disappear somewhere between 3 and 6 months of age. And you'll see how all of these ages align with skill development. And then suckling is when there's a light touch to the lips or even deep in the mouth. And there's this wave-like movement where the tongue is deeply cupped and allows for that nipple, whether it's from the bottle or from a woman's breast, to automatically suckle. Right? And that's different than just a suck, which is developed a few months later. But the suckling is a reflex to, again, extract liquid from the nipple. And it's not until about the 2nd or the 3rd month that the baby then begins to control that. So this reflex is, again, this primitive reflex for survival. And then it seems to disappear somewhere between, the 6th and the 12th month. Children vary quite a bit, but it also disappears over time as the muscle coordination and purposeful movement then begin to mature. The swallow reflex is when saliva or liquid or even food, it reaches the back of the throat and it triggers a swallow reflex. And that begins to be under control with the baby around 18 months. And then it really is lifelong. So we all have a swallow reflex. And sometimes when there's a head injury or an older person has a stroke, then that swallow reflex can be impaired and they have what we call dysphagia, which is a swallowing disorder. And so it's unsafe to eat or drink certain foods, but it can be recovered through therapy, through speech therapy. And I started way back when in brain rehab and traumatic injury. So the bite reflex is very, very interesting and very important for many reasons. But that's when if we place something, a little pressure, firm but gentle, right on their gum ridge on the side, then they will open and close their jaw. And that's typically seen after a uncomplicated birth, and you could do this easily as the parent, or as I've done it as a friend to a newborn, and where you can just put a gloved finger in and press right on their gum line, and the reflex to bite down on it. It's also very, very relaxing to infants and grown-ups, the biting down. But the transverse tongue reflex, again, is important. If you stroke the side of the tongue will move laterally. It's like a little flipper, right? And that's important. That reflex is there up, and babies start to have more control over it between 6 and 8 months, because that lateral movement, that transverse tongue sideways, is important for chewing. So when babies collect the food, they chew on it, right? They bite, they have that bite reflex, they go up and down, and then they can collect the food with their tongue tip or in the body of the tongue and scoop it out of the side of their mouth and then chew again. So they start to begin to have control between 6 and 8 months. And lo and behold, that's the same time that we begin to introduce, adult foods and table food versus just, the breast milk or the bottle fed. And then the transverse tongue seems to disappear later, somewhere between the 9th month and the 24th month. But that means that the baby's chewing pattern for more and more complicated foods and textures really develops over 9 months through their second birthday, through 24 months. And that's when they typically will have a mature, what we call a rotary grind chew. And we'll talk a little more deeply on what all of that means and how that plays a role. But the interesting thing is this transverse tongue reflex, that lateral, that is also important in speech for later developing sounds, such as the R, for example, which is one of the harder sounds in English to produce. But that's when the tongue has to retract back, and you have that lateral movement, and you have to have that on purpose, right, under control, in order to produce this very complicated R pattern. So when those are just the primary primal reflexes or primitive reflexes needed for speech and chewing. And as it relates to the structure, right? So those are kind of the function movements. The structure, when I talk about the jaw, the tongue, the cheek pads, the gums, the roof, which is also the palate, the hard palate, the top of your mouth. And then I'll also talk about nasal breathing and the throat structure. So how these kinds of the structure and the function fit together is that the jaw is at birth small and pulled slightly back. And again, remember I said the baby's mouth is this brilliant design, very different than the adult mouth. And its whole purpose is to extract liquid from a breast or a bottle and survive. So the jaw is smaller, it's slightly pulled back, and both jaws, the upper and the lower jaws, are flat in appearance and only about 30% the size of yours and mine, the adult. But the whole thing is this whole mouth, this whole structure is designed just to receive nutrients, right, through liquid extraction. The roof of the mouth, the palate, there are two parts. There's the hard palate where you have the bone, and then there's the soft palate, right? The back of the top of the mouth. And that moves up and down and elevates, closes. It's a little door to that port to up your nose. You know, if you ever start laughing and you're drinking water or soda or coffee or something, and it goes up your nose, that's because when we laugh, the soft palate is depressed. But the roof is about 50% the size of an adult. And ideally, it should be the shape of a really wide U. So it should be broader and a little dentition, but not really high and narrow. And we can talk about what happens when babies develop a high narrow palate. And it's the roof, the palate is composed of several bones that touch in the center and toward the back, and they're very, very flexible, and they're easily misshapen in a newborn. And I often tell parents, you know, you have a soft spot on the top of the head with babies. Well, that's in alignment with a soft spot in the roof of the mouth, because as the skull expands, because the brain is going to grow, then we need we need room to grow, right? And the bones will fuse somewhere around their third birthday, give or take. And so that, you know, leads me to a myth that is always out there that, you know, you'll hear or see or read that, you know, 85% of the baby's brain is fully, quote, developed by age 3. And so it's all about early intervention and early development and early this and early that. It's not that they're fully developed or 85% developed. It's simply the size or the volume, the mass of the brain in the skull. And so there's a lot of learning to do, and I used to joke and say, well, gosh, I know my dentist learned quite a bit in his 20s or her 20s. And so I know that there was a lot of brain growth in the 20s and 30s too. So he didn't stop learning or developing brain maturation at 3. It's just the mass. But, okay, so the other structures that need to be thought of is the tongue. So we talked about the jaw and the roof and now the tongue. And this is a wonderful muscle that has to fill the mouth. And with newborns, that's the whole oral cavity. You have this broad upper roof, you have this jaw that is smaller in size and retracted, and then you have the tongue really kind of filling up the whole oral space in there. And it helps maintain the shape of the roof, and that is critical. And it helps, the tongue really rests up against the roof of the mouth when the baby is just, not crying and not sucking, right? or cooing. But that's really important that it really maintains that shape. Remember, I said the roof, those bones are touching, but they're very, very, very malleable and flexible. And every time the baby swallows, I know the average child will swallow 2,000 times a day. And that's putting pressure up to, a full competent swallow is up to 5 pounds of pressure. And it's really shaping the roof of the mouth, which is the floor of the navel cavity. So these these spaces are interrelated in a baby, and they're very, very close together. The tongue is also deeply cupped and when it moves, right? And again, its primary job is to extract nutrients from a nipple. And it moves from the back to the front evenly, about 50%. And in this beautiful wave-like motion to really pull and literally extract the liquid. And then there's a beautiful pattern of sealing and unsealing with the back third of the tongue so that he can extract the liquid and then swallow it. And there's really not a lot of space in the mouth. The tongue is really filled up. And of course, you have these fat cheek pads. And again, these fatty cheek pads are developed very late in the whole gestation because that's when the baby kind of accumulates the fat. Most of the development should be happening, up until about that 37th week gestation. And then the baby takes on fat, right, to survive outside of the womb because they know that there's going to be a period where nutrients is going to be kind of, under stress with the new mom and all of that. And so the baby has some extra fat. But these cheek pads are again, part of this brilliant design that our creator did. And so there are balls of fat on the cheeks that keep everything close together and that the tongue can just rest right on the roof of the mouth. And that these fat pads rest against the gum line. And especially in full-term babies. So again, if your baby's just a couple of weeks early, they are at a higher risk of not having these fat cheek pads. And so then they could have some eating difficulties because there's too much space in their mouth. So then we take a look at the nasal passage and the nasal breathing in this structure, because that's critical when you have a mouth that's small and full, right? And its primary goal is this wave-like motion to extract the liquid. Then how the heck is the baby going to breathe? Well, it's breathing through the nose. And that's why it's really important to keep it clear. So even if it looks like the nose is very, very close to the breast, which it is during breastfeeding, but it's like this little pug nose and the babies can breathe naturally. Now, with bottle feeding, some of these elements, like the rooting, is a little depressed because they don't have to find the nipple, right? The mom or the caretaker will give the bottle nipple to the baby, so they don't really have to go looking for it. It's not like stroking their cheek or their lip and they reflexively find it. And so we have to also be very mindful with the position when we bottle feed our babies, that they're up more at a 45-degree angle. And I will talk about that a little bit later on. But this nasal breathing is really, really important to produce some good nitric oxide and oxygenated blood and all of this. But you'll hear like your newborn actually making quote unquote vocal sounds through their nose. And that's sometimes their first sounds. The air just comes out because that's their primary inhalation and exhalation. And then the last structural piece that's important to setting this all up for good eating and good talking is the throat. And again, in a small baby, the structures of the soft palate, which is, back in the throat, in the top, the roof, the epiglottis, and then the larynx, they are really, really close together. And the reason is to protect the baby from choking on the formula or the breast milk, right? And so it's really, again, this brilliant design to protect the baby, to have these primitive reflexes so that first month he can survive and start to build coordination and purpose in his motor movement and planning. So I want to talk about a little bit of tummy time, or some people call it belly time. And that's when the baby spends time on his or her belly, right? Especially since we changed, perhaps, I don't know, maybe 30 years ago, changed the sleeping positions because of SIDS, because of that horrible event that could happen on a rare occasion, but there has just happened too many times with babies sleeping on their bellies and suffocating. And so we needed to figure out a way to help prevent that quickly and more comfortably for all parents. So this belly time, though, is critical across the board because it really lays the foundation for developing proper breathing and postural control, which would be sitting and standing, as well as movement, which would include things such as rolling over, crawling, walking, eating, drinking, and talking. So all of those kind of movement, development, strength, and coordination, by laying on the belly, provides the opportunity for babies to develop these skills. And so the muscles in the baby's head, the neck, the upper spine, the shoulder girdle, the chest, the abdomen, all of those are working out through this belly time and movement. And so children who don't seem to have sufficient time on the belly really suggest to us that they're having difficulties with postural development, breathing, feeding, and speech. So us therapists, OTs, PTs, speech therapists, really seeing an increase in my 35 years of practice, certainly. And we do believe that at least this is a big piece to the puzzle, the contributing puzzle. And so babies and moms and families and parents really need to be cognizant and purposeful in changing up the positions and the body movements with these babies because of modern lifestyle, right? The medical necessity to avoid, sudden infant death syndrome. That's what SIDS is, as well as our lifestyle, which we move around a lot. We are mobile, and these kinds of factors do contribute to children with delayed motor planning, motor strength, and coordination. And we're seeing this across the board. So just imagine it this way. Your baby has spent 9 months in a flexion position, curled up, forward curl in utero, right? And that is where the body is really not stretching and not working the back muscles. We need to work out the front muscles and the back muscles to have good posture, to have good breast support. As I stand here, when I record these things, I like to stand up because I know I have better control and better thought processes, actually, because when I sit in this modern world, in this modern chair, I tend to curl forward and my brain seems to be less active and my thoughts kind of get more, as I stutter here, less fluid. So it's really important that our babies, right from the beginning, they could rest on your chest as you sit in a recliner or lean back in a sofa. And this could really begin to build that bond with your newborn, and your partner can do the same. And it really is a beautiful time if the baby takes a little cat nap right there on your chest. You're wide awake to just be present with your little one. At the same time that as they get a little stronger and you're putting them on the floor and you're face to face, it's a beautiful time to build eye contact and sustained attention. And eventually the baby will have strong enough neck muscles to look at you and reach for toys and to really start to have this kind of vocal play with you. And it's building those beginning reciprocal language exchanges. Aren't real words, but because of the natural pressure on their abdomen and their lungs, and they're beginning to hold themselves up a little bit, strengthening all of that, they're finding their voice, and it's all working together. And this is where you can really extend cooing and babbling and talking in a conversational flow. And that's where their whole respiratory system is strengthening and getting ready for sitting up and then talking. And as we're talking in this episode, including eating and chewing and all of that, but building those muscles in the front of the body on tummy time. So I wanted to just put that in there because people don't necessarily connect it all. And, and I just think it's really, really important that parents are aware that we developmental specialists and we who work with kids who are struggling want every parent to know what they can do to help support and enhance and build naturally, just in their everyday situations. And yes, there are times where you have to, carry your baby on you or put them in a seat so your hands are free and you can do work around the house or make phone calls or fix dinner or do laundry or, whatever you do at home, work at home and take care of the house. You need that freedom, of course, but in this modern day is really, really important that we find that balance, that we remember and remain cognizant that just because we're busy and our lives are much more mobile than we were when we were, farmers, that we need built-in time every single day to help our child with each and every one of these developmental steps or milestones. So keep in mind that my purpose here in this episode particularly is to help parents connect the dots and at the same time gain a broader perspective of how all of these developmental parts fit together. So although I'm focusing on the relationship between speech and eating and chewing development, I have to look at tummy time and because I think that unfortunately in this modern day and age, there are so many things that new parents have to, grasp and understand. And sometimes we're on survival mode in those first 4, 6, 8, 10 weeks. But tummy time can sometimes be an afterthought, or maybe it's a charming buzzword that new parents have heard and they kind of think about as an afterthought. My purpose here is to shed a really bright light onto the importance and the depth and the quality of really helping our babies from the get-go, from birth, with tummy time as it relates to other physical development, cognition, and especially speech and language. So all parents can really then have a deeper respect for the miracles that are happening day in and day out with just engaging with your babies, just feeding them and clothing them and loving them. And you're helping them wire their brain for lifelong growth, social connection, a curiosity to try something new or challenging, and to develop an openness to working through something that's challenging until mastery. So look at like riding a bike or learning how to swim, learning how to read a book, math at any level, planting a garden. It all takes all of these developmental milestones integrated into a whole person. And so with that, I need to include one other area, and that would be nasal breathing. It's another piece to the puzzle that cannot be overlooked. Let me explain what I mean and how it ties together with eating, chewing, speech development, and overall health. Newborns are natural nose breathers unless a problem exists at birth. So some babies do have some nasal obstruction. And when that happens, when you see constant stuffy noses, feeding problems, or those sticky eyes or goopy eyes, those could be symptoms of a nasal obstruction. It could be structural, so they're not getting the airflow. They're not able to have the natural mucus drain appropriately. And that's when you really need to speak to your pediatrician and really do your best to alleviate the obstruction and figure out why. Because a chronic stuffy nose and feeding problems and sticky, goopy eyes are symptoms telling you something is gone awry. So there are a couple of people that, I've really studied at length, and one of them is Dr. David Page, who really is considered kind of the pioneer of functional jaw orthopedics. And for a speech pathologist, the jaw is really kind of the foundation that supports everything else in speech and language processing, attention, and all of that. So he really talks about, he says, quote, "Your jaws form the gateway to your human airway and influence your life for life," unquote. But it really is important because when the jaw is at rest and your baby mouth is closed, the lips are lightly touching, the jaw, the gums are slightly touching. It's just far apart that you can kind of put a piece of paper between them. And later on, when they get their first molars, the posture at rest, when they're just sitting there breathing naturally, when they're sleeping or looking out the window or something, that at rest posture tells us that your mouth is strong and organized and aligned with itself and ready for speech or eating, the two primary things that your mouth does, but you are naturally breathing through your nose. And so the health benefits are really looking at the chemical changes that occur in your body as a result of nasal breathing. And so one of the primary results is producing nitric oxide. We know that breathing through your nose will produce more oxygenated blood, but nitric oxide is produced within the nasal sinuses, and it's secreted into your nasal passages and then inhaled through your nose. And that's the only place your body really creates and develops or produces this nitric oxide. And it's found in healthy newborns throughout their body within an hour after birth. And so a healthy baby, full term, a good nasal breather, once they kind of, get over their initial shock of being born and getting out of this perfect womb, but they start producing nitric oxide. And nitric oxide really helps prevent bacterial growth and can kill some viruses right off the bat. The studies suggest that this chemical really helps dilate blood vessels, including those in the lungs, and has an anti-inflammatory effect. So nasal breathing is so important to your baby, to you, to me, to everyone. But to really, I think nowadays, again, in this modern life that we live in, And so much is artificial, right? We're inside all the time. We have air conditioning or we have heating. We have artificial lights. We, put our babies in these little car seats all the time. All of it, all these wonderful things that they're great developments and make life easier. But we have to be mindful of what are perhaps some of the side effects, or how can we mitigate, use these wonderful technological advances, at the same time be mindful of how can we help our baby grow healthfully, right? So nitric oxide also helps oxygen be absorbed in the lungs and transport throughout the whole body. So babies who breathe through their mouths have lower levels of blood oxygen and higher levels of carbon dioxide than those who breathe naturally through their noses, because they're not inhaling and producing nitric oxide. So again, these are just kind of research facts that we're looking at the health of babies and toddlers and school-age kids as well as adults, right? And so, the husband or wife who has chronic snoring issues, who's sleep apnea, who is a mouth breather, they're having the same side effects with lack of production of nitric oxide and lower oxygenated blood, and they're tired all day long, right? So it's really important that our babies and our toddlers are, to our best of our ability, to look at maybe some things that could be affecting that, whether it's diet, allergies, the air in your house, all of those kinds of things, to always remain diligent in exploring, and don't just say, all babies get colds, all babies' noses are stuffy. And, sometimes it's structural. Sometimes, I've met babies who are really tiny and really petite. That's just kind of, I look at mom or I look at dad and very similar features. But perhaps when mom or dad, who had small features as a baby, they didn't have certain, allergens that were occluding these tiny, narrow passages to begin with. So breathing through the nose can be encouraged with appropriate feeding techniques, and that we help with the shaping of the mouth. And it's all interconnected. And it's really, really important that we look at some of these developmental bridges, right? From, taking the baby out of this perfect womb to how do we get through those first 3 months to using tummy time and belly time to help support, strengthen, and expand their control over their body in this 3-dimensional world. So let's bring it back to our primary focus of this particular episode, how early eating and speech development are connected. So we just kind of covered how the first 3 months of gaining initial control over those primitive reflexes, and how your baby is beginning to truly participate in his or her feedings. They're building social relationships with all caretakers, mom, dad, babysitters, grandparents, and they're starting to express themselves through different emotions, and, express some opinions through their coos and their giggles, their different cries, and their gurgles and their smiles. And they're really building their whole humanness in those first 3 months. So let's go back and really look at what the next steps would be. So this 3rd to 4th month period is pretty important and dynamic in growth and development. Now the baby really is beginning to develop a nice suck, swallow, breathe coordinated pattern, and they're really gaining control over these oral motor movements beyond survival, right? And so we notice between this third and fourth month that the tongue begins to change into a more 3D sucking pattern, which is quite different than just the suckling kind of primitive reflex that it has for survival at birth or during those first couple to 3 months. And so as they begin to have a more mature sucking pattern, then the fat cheek pads really start to decrease, as I mentioned. And what happens then is the baby really begins to have more control over the cheek muscle and being able to move it for a sucking versus suckling. And the jaw muscle then begins to have more control in movement during this period. And babies will have maybe 20 or more sucks without a pause. And so this whole kind of beautiful dance is happening because the baby has enough life experience and success in developing over time these maturer sucking and eating patterns. And so there's less coughing and choking. It's pretty rare around the third or fourth month because they have better control and they're more conscious of how do I do this, because I've had many hours of practice. It's just like everything else, learning how to tie your shoe or learning how to, ride a bike. The more practice you have, the more fluency and fluidity, automaticity, and you're building that neurological network where they don't have to think about it anymore. And it's not, lots of people talk about this whole muscle memory. The muscle doesn't have a memory. Your brain has the memory, and the neurons are firing more precisely and in synchronicity with itself. So you no longer have to be conscious of it. But lo and behold, during this third to fourth month, what happens regarding speech and pre-talking skills this is when the baby begins to move from just cooing and vocal play because it feels good, or the sensory perception, the gurgling and cooing is a sensory pleasure in their mouth. Remember, a baby's mouth is, quote, the window to his world. And that's how he or she is gathering all this worldly information and trying to sort it out. So as you're having both these structural and functional changes in the mouth, there's more space and the baby is beginning to produce more articulation. So this is when babbling really starts, and it will move more in line with a vowel, consonant vowel, like aga, aga, aga. And the baby's seal to the nipple, whether it's breastfed or bottle fed, have better control over their lips. And so they'll start to produce the sound, the ma, 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 ma. And again, this is motor development, not necessarily quote unquote communication, but we reinforce these particular sounds. And then the baby begins to play with it with us. And those are kind of the initial stage of communication. I say something, he says something. I say something, he laughs and gurgles. It's also important in this third or fourth month that the tongue begins to disassociate. And that's the term us speech and OTs and PTs people use because disassociation is critical to development. So visualize this, that when the baby, is first born, he's just kind of a blob. And I've heard many neuroscientists use that because they're totally helpless, right? And they move their whole body in unison, right? There's not a lot of disassociation. And disassociation also is correlated with stability. So when we want to improve coordination and motor planning and sequencing and fluidity, we need stability and disassociation. And so when this newborn begins to develop in these first 3 months, they begin to stabilize their body and move their limbs separate and their head separate. And then when they're older, then they begin to stabilize their arms or their limbs, this way the arms, and move their hand separately, right? And then they begin to stabilize their hand and disassociate and move their fingers. That's when they begin to point and touch things in the second half of that first year. So it happens the same way in the mouth. So you move the head as a whole unit. They rely on their primitive reflexes to survive and get nutrients, but then they begin to stabilize the head and they can move the jaw up and down, and that's disassociation. And then they can stabilize the jaw and move the lips separate from the jaw, and that's disassociation. And then they can stabilize the lips and move the tongue in isolation. And then they stabilize the tongue within itself. Remember, I said the tongue is this interesting muscle, the only one in our body that is attached on one end. So it has a point of origin, but no point of insertion. It's not attached, and it has to stabilize itself within itself, the front and the back and the lateral margins, and then within the other oral structures, the palate, the soft and the hard palate, the teeth and the gum lines, upper and lower. And then it has to stabilize itself and move from side to side. So some really critical developmental steps are taking place with success if the feeding pattern is growing and developing without problems. And so this disassociation, especially the back and the front of the tongue within its mouth, is very important to developing and maturing into chewing, proper drinking from a cup, and early speech. So what I'd like to do, because I know we're diving deep into this topic area, I'd like to perhaps end this episode and continue next week, because this is really where the speech and the eating development cross. And now that the baby is 3 or 4 months old, your baby, and is much more in control of the oral motor movements and purposeful play actions, he or she is engaged with you more. You've spent some really good quality time on the belly, on the tummy. They're gaining strength in the upper body. They're improved respiratory. Taking 20 sucks without a pause is really, really mature because of the quality time that they're spending on their belly with you. They're gaining intimacy with you and through good eye contact. Lots of cooing and early babbling is happening, some chuckling, some gurgles, and really those social laughs. And you can see it in your 3 or 4 month old that it's really, really purposeful and they're really connecting. So you're building this brain. Remember I said in a couple episodes ago that brains are built, not born, that babies come into this world unfinished, and it's our responsibility to really help them. And how do we do it the best in this modern world when we have a lot of conveniences that make life quote unquote easier, but it doesn't really build strength in us or our children, and we have to be mindful of that. So there's a lot of detail in this, and sometimes it's hard when you're just auditorily taking in this information, but go ahead and listen again and try to visualize these kinds of things and feel in your own mouth when you chew or when you swallow or when you say certain sounds. And what does your mouth have to do? Like just the other day, I was with a new client, a relatively new client, a nice 5-year-old boy who has great attention and beautiful language, but he cannot say the back sounds, the K and the G. He can't elevate. He does have a hypersensitive gag reflex. Some of it is genetic. Mom and dad both are kind of sensitive back there, but he had a traumatic experience with another speech pathologist before they found me. And I'm so happy that mom and the little boy were eager enough and tenacious enough to give another speech therapist a chance. But, it was horrific in the sense that this other speech therapist, kind of traumatized him by, putting a tongue depressor in the back of his mouth. And he was just, totally, gagging and choking but you don't ever do that. So my point to all of this really was in helping mom and her little guy understand what has to happen with the tongue. Remember, the tip of the tongue is kind of floating in space, and sometimes kids literally get lost in their own mouth. They're not quite sure how do I stabilize, right? And so it's about very gently understanding that the tip of the tongue rests at the lower back gum line. And it's just resting there as the back of the tongue rolls a teeny tiny bit back and up, hits your soft palate up there to produce the g, 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 or the t, or I'm sorry, the k, k, k. The K and the G are made motorically exactly the same spot. The tongue has to do the same thing. The jaw has to be a certain height. It's just that we turn our voice on or off. We phonate. We call them voiced or voiceless sounds, cognates. And so when the mom realized, oh, I see, the tip of the tongue has to just rest and stabilize in the lower ridge. And then what does the back of the tongue do? What this little boy has mastered perfectly, and it blows my mind, is that he literally flips his tongue over like a backflip, and he makes the k sound with the under part of his tip. I have no bloody idea how he does it. It's brilliant. I can't imitate it. But it's really messing his speech and articulation, his co-articulation, how he strings these sounds together to be understood. He's about, he's a really smart kid, and he's probably less than 50% intelligible when he's telling a story, because his tongue has to work too hard. It's too discoordinated trying to make this kind of faux K sound. And he can't do it with the G sound because the voicing gets in the way, and it's very complicated. But the idea here is that parents, play around. What does my tongue do when I say the back sounds? Where's my tip? And the other critical sound, the R, which, I'll do a whole episode on that, is very, very tricky. And every mouth is a little bit different. And the way that we all make the sounds, again, it's kind of regional, like New York City R's are different than LA R's. And so I encourage you, mom and dad and caretaker, grandma, teacher, whomever's listening, to play around and say, what the heck is what about my jaw heights, and what is my tongue doing to produce individual sounds? Just do the front sounds, the T and the D, t, t, t. And then what's happening when I say the k, k, k and the g, g, g? Just contrast those two. We call them the front sounds and the back sounds for easy location in your mouth. Meanwhile, the next episode, next week, I will continue this deep dive into the relationship between early speech development and eating and chewing maturation, right? And that they're correlated. And when developing smoothly, it is a beautiful maturation, a beautiful process. And it's really for a science geek like me, it's really fun to dive deep. But I want parents to have this background information. So when your fussy baby at 2, 3, 4, 5 months old, fussing around eating, it's not always just about nutrition. And yes, that's critical. I'm not denying any of that. And we will certainly dive into nutrition and good brain feeding foods and all of that. But I'm looking at the oral motor development here and how they both are interrelated. So for this week, let me know what you think. Please share and please subscribe, because then that will help me in, this infamous social media world to get and share this information with the new moms, the new dads that really want to help support this developmental first few years and lay that foundation for lifelong learning and just help your kids thrive and be happy, and communicative and free. I love that. So please share, subscribe, and I look forward to next week. Okay, take care. Bye-bye.